Mr. President, as I explained on the Senate floor yesterday, the House FISA reauthorization bill, known as FISA, has a lot of problems. More problems than a math book. Not only are the bill's purported reforms mostly fake, and where they're not fake, they're woefully inadequate, but the bill itself actually expands FISA. It expands FISA surveillance beyond where it has existed in the past. In fact, FISA authorizes the largest expansion of surveillance on U.S. domestic soil since the passage of the Patriot Act. Egregious Fourth Amendment violations against U.S. citizens will increase dramatically if this bill is passed into law as it stands now. Fortunately, there is one thing standing between that bill becoming law and that between where that bill stands now and where that bill could be soon if we enact it without amendment, and that's the United States Senate. Under Article 1, Section 7, the same bill has to pass both houses before it can be presented to the President for signature, veto, or acquiescence. FISA, as amended by the Turner Amendment, would allow the government to compel a huge range of ordinary U.S. businesses and individuals and other organizations, exempting only an odd assortment of entities, including hotels, libraries, and restaurants, to assist the United States government in spying on American citizens. Currently, the government conducts FISA 702 surveillance with the compelled assistance of what are known as Electronic Communications Service Providers, or ECSPs. Historically, the definition of such an entity, of an ECSP, has included those entities with direct access to Americans' communications. Think, for example, Google or Microsoft, Verizon, etc. This new provision would allow the government to compel warrantless surveillance assistance from any provider of any service that has access to equipment on which communications are routed and then stored. This would include a huge number of U.S. businesses that provide Wi-Fi to their customers and therefore have access to routers and to communications equipment. Now, apparently, this provision is a result of the intelligence community's ire at being told by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Court, or the FISC as it's sometimes described, that data centers for cloud computing do not, under existing law, have to comply with FISA-compelled disclosures. House Intelligence Committee members claim that it was a narrow fix to allow the government to compel information from a single service provider, just one. Now, yesterday, right here on the Senate floor, my friend and colleague, the distinguished senior senator from the state of Virginia and the chairman of the Intelligence Oversight Committee in the Senate, spoke about this now infamous Turner Amendment. First and foremost, Senator Warner admitted in that context that even he thinks the amendment could have been better drafted. This is, of course, putting it very mildly and indeed euphemistically. And instead of voting on correcting that language that could have drastic implications for the privacy and the Fourth Amendment rights of American citizens, and grave implications for all kinds of businesses and other organizations in America, he'd rather just pass the faulty, flawed, broad as can be language passed by the House and then rely on promises from the intelligence community agencies that they will not abuse this new expansion of their authority. How does that sound to you as an American citizen? To anyone within the sound of my voice, do you really feel good about agreeing to that when you hear from one of our intelligence gathering bodies, hey, you can trust us. Sure, this language is broad enough, it's got loopholes in it. You could drive a Mack truck, a 747, and an Airbus A380 through the loophole side by side. But trust us, we won't treat it that way. Is that a good idea? I think not. In fact, the entire premise of the Constitution, not just the Fourth Amendment, but of the Constitution itself, is trust but verify. We're not angels. We don't have access to angels to run our government, so we rely on rules. We don't rely on placing faith in governments. Faith is deserved for very different beings than those occupying the halls of the United States government, whether in the intelligence agencies or otherwise. As a federal lawmaker who has been lied to repeatedly throughout the years by various elements within our government, including some people from the Department of Justice and the FBI, on the abuse of the authorities, these very same authorities that we're talking about here. Forgive me if I'm not just willing to take the word of the intelligence community. We have a responsibility to our constituents, to voters everywhere, to Americans of every political stripe in every part of this country, to protect them by getting this language right, by getting it right before it becomes law, not after, when all we could say is, oh, we're sorry, or more likely, all members who support that could do is try to help them cover it up. That's not right. Second, my esteemed colleague has either been entirely confused by the protestations of the intelligence community, or he, like the Department of Justice, would like to confuse you as to what this expansion of authority actually means, what it does. They're suggesting that we're offended by this expansion merely because it would allow them to target more individuals. That is not the problem. Not at all. The problem is rather that this amendment is so broadly worded that it could subject any kind of service provider, even one providing services such as cleaning services or plumbing services, to participate in the secret compelled disclosure process on which Section 702 of FISA relies. Now, we're not concerned with new targets resulting from this legislation, as they seem to be suggesting quite mistakenly, but rather with the government conscripting any and every kind of service provider into its compelled disclosure scheme. If DOJ wants to override the decisions of the FISC through an amendment, it must be done through an amendment tailored to precisely that task. Unfortunately, the Turner Amendment is about as well tailored as a muumuu, or better said, a tent, meaning there's no tailoring at all. They just threw it all in there. Like Prego spaghetti sauce, this thing is said to contain whatever they want it to contain. Again, Senator Warner yesterday acknowledged this language was poorly drafted, but instead of taking this as an opportunity to amend it, to fix it so that it did what it was actually purported to be intended to do, and to go no further than that, and to incur no additional grave risk of further meddling, of creating problematic situations for law-abiding Americans everywhere, he suggests that this will be a problem for 2 years, and then we can fix it. Or that it won't be a problem for the next 2 years because we can have faith and trust that they won't abuse it, and then we can fix it for real. In fact, he's willing to work with anyone who thinks it's a problem to fix it any time. Just not now. Doesn't want to fix it now. If the job is worth doing, it's worth doing it right now, the first time. Not just so that we don't have to go back and correct it later, but so that it doesn't create problems between now and 2 years from now when he proposes we address it for real. It's worth doing right today, as the stakes are high. There's no reason not to fix this now, and a lot of reasons why it will be problematic if we don't. Now, let's talk about the statutory deadline for FISA collection for a minute. The administration acknowledges that under the law, it can and will continue to conduct FISA 702 surveillance collection, even if 702 temporarily lapses while we debate this. That's because the FISA court has approved a certification within the last week or so that allows the government to continue 702 collection until April 2025. And there's a provision of FISA that you might say sort of grandfathers in FISA court certifications, even if the law itself expires. Meaning the FISA 702 collection program can continue in its entirety without exception until April 10th or 11th, 2025, even if FISA 702 temporarily lapses between now and then. Because all that matters was that FISA 702 was active, intact, not having lapsed as of the moment on April 11th, just over a week ago, when the latest certification was issued by the FISC. Now, notably, Mr. President, the administration does not deny this. What it's saying instead is that companies will bring legal challenges and that they might refuse to comply with the government's directives to turn over communications. What I'd like to know, Mr. President, is so what's their evidence for this? The fact that a few companies briefly refused, to cooperate with the government back in 2008, when the predecessor to Section 702, the Protect American Act, expired. Now, here's the problem with that argument. Those companies, back in 2008, challenged this, and they lost in court. The FISA court ruled in 2008 that surveillance could continue despite expiration of the law and that the companies had to comply. So this legal issue was itself settled on those terms 16 years ago. Not only that, Mr. President, but much more to the point here, Congress has actually made the law even stronger, even clearer, even more direct since then. Stronger on the government's side since then. The FISA Amendments Act includes language that wasn't in the Protect America Act, saying that the FISA court's approval remains valid notwithstanding any other provision of the law, including the sunset. You see, that language was added for the first time in December of 2018. In the same legislation that FISA 702 was reauthorized until 2023, till December of 2023, when we extended the effective date of FISA 702 back in December of 2023, extending it until tonight at midnight. That language was re-upped. It was enacted again. And so that same language is intact. There is absolutely no ambiguity here. So it's absurd what they're saying, really. I mean, why would companies risk fines of $250,000 a day to make a legal argument that the FISA court rejected 16 years ago? This is simply not a valid reason for us in the United States Senate to rush to enact laws as deeply flawed and as detrimental to American civil liberties as this one. All I'm asking for, Mr. President, is votes on amendment. We have a reasonable list of 9 amendments offered by a bipartisan group of senators, reflecting almost every point along the ideological continuum of the Senate. If Chairman Warner and Senator Schumer would just stop blocking these votes, we could finish consideration of FISA today. We could wrap this up today. The problem is, they know the American people agree with us on these amendments. They know that a lot of these are really, really popular. They agree with reforming this program to stop the warrantless surveillance of themselves, of the American people. And so certain members of the United States Senate are somehow afraid that these votes must not be considered lest they pass, because they are really afraid of what would happen if or when they did pass. Think about that for a minute. They don't want us to cast votes on something, not in spite of their lack of popularity, but because of their popularity. That should concern us all. So to that end, Mr. President, I'm going to try to move these things forward. Let's see if we can resolve this. I'd love to be able to resolve this tonight, get it done tonight, get it over to the House of Representatives, which is still here, still in town. And it's really convenient, Mr. President, because as they set this up a couple of centuries ago, we both work in the same building. They're just down the hall. I'll personally walk it down there to them if that'd help. So I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that the motion to proceed. I will hold on to that for a moment, and I will continue. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to extend my remarks to an additional up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
So, if that really is the concern, that is the concern that I'm hearing from some colleagues, a number of colleagues on both sides of the political aisle have been telling me, as I've been talking about the need to vote on amendments. What a number of them are saying is, we can't do this, because if we do it, it's going to expire, and if it expires even momentarily, it's going to be Armageddon, dogs and cats living together in the streets, stuff right out of the book of Revelations, absolute chaos and pandemonium. So if that's the case, let's get it done now. But it's not the case. FISA 702 collection is not going to end. And these same companies that objected in 2008 and lost where the law was much less in the government's favor than it is now, will remember what happened. And all they have to do is read. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to read the language passed in 2018 and again in December of 2023 to make clear that that collection may and indeed will continue. So, in the spirit of moving this forward and getting it done tonight, I ask unanimous consent that the motion to proceed to H.R. 7888 be agreed to. I ask further that the following amendments be the only amendments in order. Lee, number 1840, Paul, number 1829, Marshall, number 1834, Wyden, number 1820, Hirono, number 1831, Merkley, number 1822, Paul, number 1828, Durbin, Amendment 1832, and Paul, Amendment number 1833. Further, that the Senate vote on the above amendments in the order listed with the Paul amendments 1828 and 1829 and Merkley Amendment 1822, subject to 60 affirmative votes required for adoption, that upon disposition of the Paul Amendment on 1833, the bill be read a third time, and that the Senate vote on passage of H.R. 7888 as amended, if amended, with 60 affirmative votes required for passage and with 2 minutes for debate equally divided prior to each vote.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. I appreciate my friend, the gentleman from Utah's strong feelings on this bill. He has been consistent repeatedly. I differ greatly. I believe 702 is one of the critical aspects of our national security regime. Literally 60% of information that appears in the President's daily brief is obtained from Section 702. Again, I disagree with the gentleman as well in terms of the fact that we have seen prior to 2008, when the preceding bill expired for a brief period of time, there are entities that said, we no longer have to participate with the government. I think that is a risk that we cannot afford to take with the vast array of challenges our nation faces around the world. I'd also point out, and I know to some of my colleagues it's not been enough, but the Senate FISA bill, the House FISA bill has 56 separate reforms in it. Matter of fact, through processes that have already at least publicly partially in process, we've seen the FBI's non-compliance rate on their own queries of 702 drop from about 30% non-compliant to less than 1%. We've got reforms that make sure there are no further batch queries. There's not the kind of effort where people could, simply have the right to query a 702 database without showing a reason. Making sure as well, as critics have pointed out, that should an American that is an elected official or a religious figure or a journalist a whole extra set of reforms put there as well. I believe we need to proceed on this. I know both sides are negotiating in good faith. I think those negotiations need to continue, and therefore I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
The senator from Utah.
I appreciate the thoughtful words that have been presented by my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from Virginia, who also chairs the Senate's Intelligence Oversight Committee. It's unfortunate that he's unwilling to have these amendments even considered. It's especially unfortunate because it appears to be predicated on the risk of FISA 702 lapsing. Now, unless we do something on this in the meantime, it is going to lapse at least for a period of time. As I made clear a moment ago, the language we adopted in 2018 and that we re-upped in December of last year, 2023, makes abundantly clear that the FISA 702 collection can continue unabated through April of 2025, based on the recertification by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Court, I believe on April 11th. That's allowed to continue for 1 year following the certification, as long as FISA 702 was still intact and non-expired as of the moment of the certification, which it was. But even if that were not the case, if what we're worried about here is the clock, look, I've drafted, and I can't speak for anyone other than myself, but I've drafted and would gladly accept, if that really is the concern, a short-term extension of FISA 702, if by doing so that would make the difference between us being able to consider these amendments, vote on them, and send it back to the House of Representatives without doing so under the threat of this amorphous and unsubstantiated fear that FISA 702 collection is going to go dark, which, of course, it's not. But look, once again, we do find ourselves at the mercy of Senate Democrat leadership, with the majority leader in particular acting as the doorkeeper of the Senate, only allowing access to the floor to senators who wish to offer their amendments, and only if those amendments are amendments that the majority leader knows he can defeat. He's so determined to block amendments that he's willing to obstruct the quick passage of this bill. Now, I just offered to speed up the consideration of the FISA reauthorization bill passed by the House, RISA as it's known, which many of its advocates desperately want to see passed before midnight today, in exchange for just votes on 9 amendments. Just votes. Not guaranteed outcomes, but just votes commensurate with, consistent with what the rules of the Senate already allow, with non-germane amendments set at 60, germane amendments set at a simple majority threshold. It's really not too much to ask, but Senator Schumer and the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence wouldn't take the deal. Why? Well, part of it is the time issue that I mentioned, that an entity no less right-wing than the New York Times just earlier this week pointed out that argument really doesn't hold water, and if it does, I'm happy to agree to a time agreement to extend it. The only other reason I can think of is there's a fear on the part of those who want RISA to pass in exactly the form that the House of Representatives enacted it. They're afraid that some of these amendments might actually pass. Now, 6 of these amendments are germane to the bill. So, yeah, they could pass with a simple majority vote. And that's exactly why some in this chamber won't allow these amendments to be voted on. They don't want reforms to the bill. They'd rather let the bill expire instead of letting the Senate do its work and amend the bill in a manner consistent with the expressed desires and indeed the demands from many quarters among the electorate, left and right, east and west, north and south. It's a sad commentary on where we stand in the democratic process today. Now, some might say that we can't pass these amendments because that would send it back to the House, and then the House would have to repass it. But isn't that how the lawmaking process is supposed to work? I mean, that's exactly how Article 1, Section 7 contemplates it. It was never meant to be super easy to pass legislation through a bicameral legislature, and that is, in fact, what we have. I mean, aren't we supposed to vote on amendments? Not just for a show or a head pat, but to improve the bill, to see whether or not the House will take the modifications, rather than just assuming, as if we were adopting some sort of House legislative chamber doctrine of infallibility, that what they wrote, it must be treated as if it were carved into stone and that we can't touch it. That's nonsense. That's not how this works. It's never how it was intended to work. Certainly should not be how it works in this circumstance, and not with a bill like this, where Americans at every point along the ideological continuum have concerns about this. Now, there are a number of us in this chamber who feel this way. I have very good friends on the other side of the aisle with whom I frequently disagree on a wide variety of other issues, but with whom I agree closely on this issue. And we're reflective of our constituencies and of the American people generally. And the House is actually in session this weekend, here in the same building, still in session, so it's standing by, ready to actually take up our amended bill whenever we can get it passed. But Senator Schumer and Senator Warner are preventing us from performing one of our most basic duties. We've got one or two members who are acting as doorkeepers to the Senate. And meanwhile, the other 98 members or so are being prevented from even having our improvements to the bill considered. And many of these, if not most of them, are pretty widely bipartisan. So this sort of thing, when it happens, renders us something of a legislative rubber stamp. It's not something that we aspire to. So look, like I say, it's unfortunate that we couldn't come to an agreement on this. So I just ask the question. If the clock is really the enemy here, why not just extend it? I stand ready and willing, speaking for myself, to extend the clock, whether it's for a few days or a week or so that we can have time to consider it. I'm willing to do that. If we won't do that, then maybe we're not really hearing the real reason for the opposition. Thank you, Mr. President.